All right, the microphone is on. Be careful what you say. I've been asked to say that this is Kurt Senske, Best Practices Ministries Conference. I have no idea what the title of my thing is, but I think it's something like The Art of Governance as a Competitive Advantage. And we're in room 18, and it is Friday at 2 p.m. All right, I've done it. Okay. So, thanks for being here Friday afternoon talking about governance. I promise we're going to make it fun. It won't be Jeff Schrank level fun, but it's going to be fun. A couple of things what this is not going to be. So this will not be a seminar on the science of government or governance. So, for example, we're not going to talk about the best practices from the art or from the science of governance. So, as an example, we will not talk about whether or not you want to be a pilot or a watchdog board. We won't talk about what it means to have duty of care, duty of obedience. I'm assuming that everybody in this room, or at least most people in this room, have had some level of experience in governance so that we can take it to a different level. Now, if you haven't, that's okay too, because we can backfill later. I can provide you with some information. I can provide you with some things where you go to. But from my perspective, the science of governance, while it's really important from a fiduciary responsibility, that's in some ways the easy part. I mean, in today's world, you can Google best practices, right? And you can go to BoardSource. You can go to now ISO 37000. You can go to the Carver model. You can go to all sorts of different materials and experts to help you with the science piece. What's more interesting to me, and especially after I delve into the research, is the art of governance. And the art of governance is figuring out what makes the most sense for your congregation, what makes the most sense for your organization to have an effective governance model. And the reason, as I'll get into in a second, this is so important is because the research demonstrates that if you have a healthy pastor-board relationship or a healthy leadership, CEO board relationship, coupled with effective governance, you're much more likely to enjoy congregational or organizational success than if you don't. It's that important. So just to get a sense of who is in this room, and you can raise your hand more than once if you would like, but who is a pastor in this room that's leading a congregation? All right. Who is a pastor in this room that's membership is, say, over 500? Who less than 500? Okay. Who is a lay leader on a council or a board or a committee within your congregation? Okay. Who is a executive director, CEO, principal, etc., of an organization that is not a church? Who has served as a board member or is serving as a board member of an organization that is not a church? Okay. So we have a little bit of both here, right? A lot of everybody's involved one way or another with our congregation. Some in leadership roles, some in pastor roles, some in board roles. Lots of board members and even some CEOs of organizations in this room as well. So what I'm going to show today is a roadmap of how your organization or your churches, and if I say organization, think church. If I say church, think organization. How your governance practices can drive missional success. And I'm convinced that those organizations that do so will be at a distinct advantage vis-a-vis their peers who do not. Now, in the nonprofit organizational terms, I call this the art of governance as a competitive advantage. I follow the Steve Jobs rule of PowerPoints, by the way. I don't use them a lot because I don't think it encourages healthy and deep dialogue. But I will have a few just to keep us going and to have a couple of lists. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoint afterwards, just let me know. Give me an email address. I'm happy to send it to you. Anything we talk about, I'm happy to send you as well. So, the question is, why should you listen to me? And during my governance, or during my career, I've been blessed to view this governance dance from 3 different perspectives. I served as CEO for 23 years at Lutheran Social Services of the South, now Upbring. I'm currently serving as a consultant to a number of different nonprofit organizations, districts, universities, foundations, as a consultant. And I've also been privileged to serve on board of directors of 11 different boards. I'm currently serving as chair of Lutheran Hour Ministries and Thrivent Charitable. I also serve as treasurer right now of what's called the ACTS Network, and that's a 501c3 organization whose mission, especially prior to COVID, was to plant churches and congregations within Central Texas. And then finally, I serve as treasurer, and I would strongly encourage you to never do this on my homeowners association board of directors. It's the worst, hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It is human beings at their worst. But I've served as chair of Thrivent Financial. I've served on the LCMS board of directors. I served as chair of LCMS World Relief Human Care. Under presidents such as Al Berry and Jerry Kieschnick and now Matthew Harrison. But my first board assignment, or my first board as a board member, was with a Lutheran school in Austin, Texas. And I was assistant to the president at Concordia University at the time, and been to a few of their board meetings, so I thought I knew what boards were like, right? Because Concordia at the time followed policy-based governance. And I went to the first meeting, and we all crammed into the principal's office, which was a fairly small office. There were 6 or 7 of us. And I quickly realized that this is a whole different world. And that one of the items on the agenda is that we were going to decide who could have the key to the kitchen. And this was a very important conversation, apparently, to everybody. And I had no idea of who any of these players were, because we didn't even have children at the time. I was just asked to serve on the board, and for some reason said yes. And then the next order of business was, all right, we're all going to get together this weekend, and we're going to paint Mrs. Cruzy's room, because her classroom needs a new paint. So pretty quickly I realized that this was not a policy-based governance board, but this was rather a board where we all pulled our sleeves up and we worked, man. But it also taught me a lot about how you probably don't want to do governance. And we were having the wrong people making the wrong decisions at the wrong time, basically. So it's interesting because as a board member, and especially today, you're given an almost impossible role. I mean, you're asked on a part-time, typically unpaid basis to manage and to oversee an increasingly complex church, increasingly complex organization. Your employees, your clients, your members, donors, they expect you to get this right. Being a CEO, being a pastor, is also increasingly difficult. You know, managing through culture wars, managing through the pandemic, outdated technology, increased competition, new competition. You know, you lead in an environment where change is the only constant. And under this new normal, it's complicated and it's changed how churches and organizations are effectively governed. So, you know, board challenges, of course, they are not new. I love this quote, God made idiots, that was for practice, then he made boards. But maybe more seriously, someone that we all respect as a thinker, Peter Drucker, says there's only one thing that all boards have in common, they do not function. And you know, it's frustrating, right? Because as good leaders, as good pastors, you want to work with a board that can add value to your congregation. as board members, you want to effectively use your time and your skill sets to enhance the organization as you support the CEO, the president, the pastor. And the question becomes, why is this shared partnership of governance so difficult? And I'm a big believer that, contrary to the advice of some consultants, there'll never be a uniform model that perfectly fits the governance needs of your unique organization. You know, the governance needs of a congregation are different than a nonprofit organization, are different than a university, are different than a private school. And it could be a starting point, you know, so you may want to take a look, for example, at the Carver model, or you want to take a look at some book and say, you know, this is a great starting point, but it's never the end. So every organization will have its own unique history, its regulatory strengths, its culture, its operating environment, its unique community, which, from my perspective and the research that you'll see in my book and that we'll talk about today, demands a governance model that's tailored for your unique church, for your unique organization. So the question becomes, with everything else on your plate, why is this so important? And so, as I was writing this book over the last few years and doing the research and talking to various different CEOs and pastors of mega congregations, it became very clear that an effective governance model coupled with a healthy pastor or CEO relationship, CEO board relationship, is a key predictor of organizational success. And so the research also found that in order for this to occur, there's several non-negotiables that need to be present within your governance model. And we'll talk about that in a second, and we'll also talk at the end, providing a scorecard, whether or not you and your organization, you and your congregation are actually at that point, or where are there pieces that you can work on. What's a little frustrating to me, and what's interesting as well, is one, my phone's been ringing off the hook because it seems like everybody these days, including my organizations, are having some sort of governance challenge they're trying to work through. It's just part and parcel, I think, of the environment that we live in, the post-COVID environment, that needs attention. Now, what's frustrating to me is that oftentimes the pastor or the CEO or the district president will say, yeah, I know I need to do this, but I also have to do this, this, and this first. And from my perspective and my experience in this world is that if you don't have an effective governance model, you're not going to probably accomplish the other things as well. So you may be doing it simultaneously, but this should not be put on the back burner. So for those who, especially smaller and mid-sized congregations, there's a new book that came out just about a month ago by David Peter, who's a professor over at Concordia Seminary. And from my perspective, it's an outstanding book. And it's worth purchasing if you are a pastor of a smaller or mid-sized organization or congregation. And what I like about what David does is David talks about there are three different governing models within most churches, right? So if I recall correctly, they are the working model, the managing model, and the governing model. And so it doesn't necessarily matter which one you use, but he provides some really good counsel and tips in terms of, if you use this one, how can you make it even better? I would say his book's probably 80% science and 20% art, while mine's probably 80% art and 20% science, so it's actually a pretty good match. But I wanted to mention this because I've used this with a small congregation that I've worked with, and they found that to be very helpful. So the non-negotiables, according to the research, in terms of creating an effective governance model are, trust, integrity, intentionality, respect, and openness. Now, I realize I'm being taped, so I'm going to be careful of how I say this. But as in my experience, and it doesn't matter which president in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod that I worked with, and it's not the president per se, but it's the system in which we operate. Oftentimes, this is missing, and I've seen this in other organizations as well. And so what you might find as a result is, for example, a policy manual that is overly prescriptive, overly long, because you try to control everything through your policy manual. There was an organization, non-LCMS related, where they didn't, not only did the board not trust the CEO, so they put in all sorts of restrictions for the CEO, they didn't trust the board chair. So the governing group, the committee that was in charge of creating the policy manual, also severely restricted the board chair from actually being able to do his or her job. This is so key for the rest to work that it's worth spending time working on. And oftentimes it's just taking the time to get to know each other. So as a pastor and as a CEO, I know you're busy. I know you don't have time for this, but you need to, right? It's creating those relationships with those who are on your committees, with those who are on your board of directors. It's finding time so the board's members themselves can meet together for breakfast, for dinner, to have events together so that they see each other outside maybe just the typical board meeting environment. The second is a very focused mission and reason for existing. And sometimes churches will say, well, we got this in spades, right? It's Matthew 28, we're going to spread the gospel. Well, it's also more than that. So it's a question of within your, providing and spreading the gospel, what are the skill sets, what are the strengths, what are the opportunities for your congregation to really have an impact within your community? It could be your school, it could be outreach, it could be adventure, it could be transformation, which is what we talk about at our own congregation. I'll get back to that in a second, because I think what the research is increasingly showing, whether you work for a university, whether you work for a nonprofit organization or a congregation, is if you can create and a mission, and I wouldn't get wrapped up in terms of the terms, whether it's mission or vision or however you want to describe it, but a 3-sentence, understanding of what you are here for, why you're here on this earth, and then cascade down and to figure out ways that over the next 3 years we'll do this, over the next year we'll have this goal, and we'll get back to that in a second. The third is intentional succession planning. It's amazing to me on the nonprofit side how few people do this, whether it's interim or emergency or long-term. On a board that I serve as chair, we started having this conversation with the CEO in the first year that she was CEO, because we think it's that important. And we also think that it allows us to have that conversation in a very neutral and trust-filled environment, knowing that this is the first year and that she's doing an amazing job. But it's just part and parcel of a routine that we've developed on a yearly basis. On the congregation side, oftentimes they'll say, well, we got the district involved, we don't really do this. I can give you some great examples of congregations who have done this, and it's been very successful. My old congregation in St. Louis, Webster Gardens, just went through a very successful transition that was very intentional and well planned out, that allowed them to continue with their mission without missing a beat. Again, sometimes this is harder for churches than in other organizations, but other organizations have this issue as well. But how do you hold not only the CEO, not only the staff accountable, but each other accountable? So one of the Concordia universities has they have a new strategic plan. And they also have committees that are within their board. And so what they've done is each committee and each senior staff member, each committee leader and each senior staff member are responsible for a specific aspect of the strategy. And so they will come back to the board on a quarterly basis and discuss whether or not they've hit their goals, as a way to not only hold the board accountable, but to also hold the executive leadership team accountable as well. And more important today probably than ever, I think we've all seen in the past where boards and congregations and organizations will pretty much ask anybody to serve on their board just to fill slots sometimes, because it's oftentimes very difficult to find people that are willing to serve. What we're finding is that, and the research demonstrates this, in fact, McKinsey and Company, a consulting group, demonstrates very clearly that any sort of organization that has a diverse board is going to be more successful overall than an organization with a homogeneous board. And so diversity matters. Now, diversity will mean different things based on your congregation, based on your organization than others. So as an example, in my old organization at Upbring, a few of you may remember that I was involved during the Trump administration with a visit with Melania Trump to the border. And it was that weekend where she wore that infamous jacket that said, I don't care. And she was meaning the media, but they took it to mean all of our wonderful programs for undocumented minors that are along the Texas border. But the reason I bring this up is during the Trump administration, our organization was sometimes caught in a really weird situation where we were trying to serve the least of these, yet we didn't want to get caught up in the political uproar because we were afraid it was going to hurt some of our other programs as well. And our constituents and our stakeholders were either on one side or the other. What we found very helpful at our board level is to have board members that looked at this perspective both from a Democrat side as well as a Republican perspective, so we could have that honest conversation about what made most sense for our organization and how can we continue to serve the least of these. And then finally, as we mentioned before, the understanding that each organization is unique, and that the challenge and the opportunity is to create an organization that is right, or create a governance model that is right for your congregation, for your organization. So the question becomes, what are the issues that you might face as you create and implement and evolve in terms of your governance model? And in my experience, almost everything can be categorized in one of two buckets: plumbing or people. So what plumbing is, it's a structural or cultural impediment where over time, it probably made sense 20, 30 years ago, but over time it's going to place your organization in a competitive disadvantage. And so as an example, it might be antiquated bylaws or articles of incorporation that no longer make sense for your particular organization or congregation. So at Lutheran Hour Ministries, we have a couple of former and current board members here in this room. And we realized a few years ago that while a female could actually be the executive director or president of Lutheran Hour Ministries, under our bylaws, they were not allowed to be a board chair. And with females making up most of our donors at this point, we thought that this was not a good thing for a lot of different reasons, including being the right thing to do. So we went to our membership and asked to change the bylaws to allow a female to be a board chair if that ever occurred. Another example is back in, say, Lutheran Brotherhood days. All of their board members were elected in a convention of 500 members, and they're typically wonderful Lutheran ladies and men who got together and had a big party, and they voted for whoever they thought was the best board member to serve on the board of this Fortune 500 company, right? So the year that I was asked to run and give a speech, what we realized is that if you're an actuary or an accountant, you don't know how to give good public speeches. And so people like me won. People who were in those categories did not win. And we ended up with a board that actually had no financial expertise on the board of directors. In an investment company. So obviously that got changed in the merger as well. I know Linda Arnold's here, and she's on our committee that's looking at our policies at Lutheran Hour Ministries. And one of the questions that we're wrestling with is, should we have 6-year term limits or 9-year term limits? And it feels like we're turning over board members very quickly because we only have 6-year term limits, 3. And so the question is, do we want to move them to 9? And we'll probably ask our membership to do that as well. Another plumbing issue is, how are your board meetings structured? So what's fascinating to me is, if you watch and if you look at boards' agendas or congregations' agendas of their board meetings, or nonprofit organizations, 90% of the time on average, you're looking backwards. So you're looking at financial results, you're hearing programmatic reports, you're looking at the last quarter, the last year. Best practice, and again, this is a cultural change, so it's a plumbing issue, is to structure board meetings where you're looking forward and you're looking strategically at least 50% of the time. So it may be carving out a day and a half or so of a retreat where you have experts come in, where you talk strategically, where you understand where the environment's going, where you're looking at what are the risks and what are the potential new competitors out there. It's really important to do, and it also allows the board members as well as the leadership team to feel like we're all in this together as we're creating the future as opposed to looking at the past. You know, the other question, and this comes in some ways, it dovetails with, are you spending 50% of your time looking at forward? Does your congregation's mission, does your organization's mission have the same clarity as John F. Kennedy's speech in his famous speech about landing a man on the moon within the next 10 years? You know, every single employee at NASA understood his or her role with respect to that mission. You know, about 5-6 years ago at Lutheran Social Services of the South, we realized that our mission had gotten tired and that we could no longer be all things to all people. And so, because we had a healthy relationship with the board, we said, all right, we've got to take a hard look at this and figure out what can we be best at within our communities, where can we make the biggest impact. And where we landed was having a very clear mission that we were going to break the cycle of child abuse within the state of Texas. Now, having that clarity of mission allowed us to make some really difficult decisions. It allowed us to sell retirement communities. It allowed us to change our brand to Upbring. It allowed us to create new programs both on the social services side as well as the education side. It allowed us to create a new research arm, an advocacy arm, a product development lab, all understanding that it's in purpose of our new, very clarified mission, but also creating this meta leadership of culture, understanding that we can't do this by ourselves. But if we didn't have this clarity of mission, we would not have been able to make those difficult decisions. And so I know, for example, Lutheran Church Extension Fund recently talked about what is their mission. Concordia Irvine really talked about what is their clarity of mission going forward, and others as well. And it's important because then you can figure out, all right, in the next 3 years, what do we have to do to accomplish this? We can get people excited about this. And then we can also have an early win within that first year. But then we can also work backwards and say, all right, what do we need to do in the next 90 days, 180 days to keep this going? On the people bucket side, you know, what I found the most is that just not having the appropriate diversity of skill sets and experiences sitting around that table. You know, it could be ethnicity, it could be age, it could be gender, it could be religion, life experiences, profession. All of those have potential to add value to your church. But if you surround yourself by well-meaning people who don't have the right skill sets, who don't have their different diversity of experiences, at best, you're going to get groupthink. At worst, you're going to get bad advice, and you're going to be leaving feeling pretty frustrated, and the board members will probably feel pretty frustrated as well. I was actually with a senior living community a little while ago, and they were actually looking at whether or not they should merge with another community. And it became, and so the CEO brought me in to have this conversation because he wanted to be a full participant, and so he needed somebody to facilitate. Became very clear pretty early on to himself, to me, to even all of the board members, that he simply didn't have the right skill sets sitting around that table to provide them with any sort of worthwhile advice. They are all well-meaning, wonderful people, but they weren't useful as it relates to that particular decision. You know, it's also interesting, and maybe one of the more interesting things in the research that I think we all knew intuitively, I've just never really thought about it. But as you're looking for board members, as you're looking for pastors and leadership on your staff, as you're looking for members of your senior leadership team, as you're selecting a CEO, in addition to obviously integrity and passion, which is a given, maybe the most important thing from the research is emotional intelligence. That if, you know, the research demonstrates that a group can, someone can add to the emotional intelligence of a group and someone can subtract to the emotional intelligence of a group, but the group actually has a collective emotional intelligence. And one bad person on the board can actually bring it down pretty dramatically. And so as you interview people, whether it's for boards, whether it's for leadership positions, one of the key things I look at now is what is this individual's emotional intelligence? I talked about this HOA board I'm on, and 5 of the 6 board members are actually outstanding. There's this one who's apparently a nice guy, but he's a systems engineer with no emotional intelligence, and he thinks everybody should think like he does, but he doesn't have the understanding and the empathy to realize that that just isn't how the real world operates. And so we're at loggerheads every single meeting, and he just doesn't seem to get it, and he's a nice guy. But as you think about that, it's important, and probably even more important in spades, especially if you're executive director, president, a CEO, a pastor, is the emotional intelligence of your board chair. Your board chair that is the person that's going to herd the cats. That is the person that's going to be your partner in ministry. That is the person that's going to 95% of the time be walking with you, and that person is so key in terms of the emotional intelligence aspect of it. Brian, yeah.
Maybe you know some of the people that are on your list to be recruited, but what if some new person comes to you via a friend of a friend? What might be a couple of paths to try to discover emotional intelligence?
Yeah.
Maybe a really
Breakfast,
nice
lunch, and
person
dinner.
Yeah. Doug answered one way to answer this. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So, you know, when we were interviewing CEOs for various different organizations, we would see them in as many different types of settings as possible. And so, for example, I remember one dinner with a prospective CEO and his spouse. He treated the spouse pretty poorly in this dinner, which made us notice some other red flags, right? Another person at a breakfast meeting couldn't keep a conversation going. And so that's one aspect of it. You know, some of it's intuitive. I have a friend who's a CEO, and he phrases it very simply. He says, "Is the person a jerk?" And sometimes you can figure that out pretty quickly, right? So, but there are ways to get at it, but that's the simplest answer. Is that person a jerk? You know? Do you want to... another friend of mine, and this probably goes back to the old days when this is appropriate, but his response was, do you want to go have a beer with this individual? And if you do, he's probably or she's probably going to be a pretty good board member. That's not necessarily politically correct anymore, but I think you get the gist. Any other comments, questions? I've been rambling way too long, so I'll take a breath and see what's on people's minds. Anything?
You started with the observation that the research shows that a good relationship between the pastor, CEO, whatever, and the board is like a prerequisite for success.
Yes.
That seems relatively. That seems like well, of course.
Yeah.
Like, why is that? So was it a surprise, or was it just like we all knew this, we finally quantified it, sort of a conclusion?
So what's interesting to me is how often that does not occur. And it may be a trust issue. It may be looking at it from a different perspective. It may be just coming from different worldviews. And then on occasion, not very often, but on occasion, it may be well deserved, right? If the CEO or the pastor is withholding certain information or not sharing everything. That's a trust issue that the board's got to figure out. Yeah.
It's a little off the wall and very theoretical, but suppose you have a church and you want better diversity. Normally, church boards are structured to have people only from within the organization.
Yeah.
Would there be any benefit in structuring it so that you include people who are outside your context, who have expertise of a sort that would help your mission?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, obviously there are some bylaws and articles that don't allow that, right? You have to be a member of the congregation. You have to be such and such. There, if, for example, you have a committee or some board that oversees the school, you might want to have someone who's not necessarily a member, but who might be a parent or an alumnus. I've seen nonprofit organizations where they really are intent of having former clients or someone who's received a grant from that foundation, because there's a different perspective that they might not have. So I think it's a little bit more difficult in a congregation. If anybody has examples of how you've done it, I'd love to hear that, because typically the answer is you don't.
Is it a change that would be worth contemplating, in your opinion?
I think that's got to be up to your local congregation, because I think in some situations maybe, but in some situations I'd be hesitant. I mean, you're a pastor back there. Would you have a non-member serve on your board of directors?
Probably not.
Yeah.
But we do look for diversity
Okay.
on our particular board of directors in the Carver model.
And how would you define diversity in your context?
Age diversity.
Yep.
In our context, diversity in which worship services they attend and so forth, because that brings with it, at least in our context, some sort of leanings.
Yeah, yeah.
Traditionalist? Am I more contemporary? Am I, in a congregation that has 1,000 people in contemporary worship and 200 in traditional in our congregation?
Right.
Right? It's like, so we need to have a balance between that, because if we loaded it up with traditional people who attend our 8 o'clock service, then all of a sudden,
Yes.
right. But I don't know
Yeah.
from the outside, because we're so mission driven.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
And one last comment on that before I forget it. What I'm also seeing in spades is, because technology is all-encompassing in everything we do, no matter what organization or congregation we're involved with, there really is a push and to go look for people with technology experience. That's probably going to be a younger person without board experience, and so you're going to have to do maybe a better job of training that individual. But I've been in way too many meetings with average age of 60-year-olds, and the technology conversation is not good, right? Because we're just, Doug.
And while we wouldn't put a non-member on the board, we do invite in advisors around what we're dealing with to get that diversity. So if you're looking at strategic planning, bringing in somebody who doesn't think like you do to challenge your thinking, or expansion of facilities, you bring in that expertise because they're not on your board most likely.
Yes.
And so there are times where bringing external resources in to temporarily work with the board, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yep, I would agree with that. I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
I would also assume, though, there would be space for community input if you're talking about how you're going to serve the neighborhood and love the neighborhood. You're going to need people from the neighborhood.
Yes.
I mean, hopefully some of those people are in the church, but if they're not,
And-
design something and just throw it at.
And it could be an ad hoc committee. It could be, it could be formal. It could be informal. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, Vince.
I now serve a 173-year-old congregation, so I'm learning the benefits of people who are not from 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th generation families serving on our board. So folks that are newer to the place, which is kind of a radical idea, and people that are not genetically Lutheran.
Yeah.
If we're trying to reach people that are not currently in a relationship with Christ, then I have to find some people for whom that relationship is a little more recent
Yes.
than folks that were born into that relationship.
Which also means, Vince, right, you're going to have to change a little bit the culture of your board meetings, right? Because they don't have that history. I've seen a nonprofit board where they brought in non-Lutherans for the first time, and they said, okay, everybody say the common table prayer. People had no idea what we were talking about, right? Yeah, and so you have to, as you change, you also have to make very aware that the people you invite feel comfortable within that setting.
Yes.
Yeah, but I applaud you for moving beyond the 5th and 6th generations, as important as they are.
We
Yeah.
use the terminology pastor/CEO.
Yes.
And I would be interested from the group comments. That's not, I've run into two schools of thought.
Yeah.
And this is from pastors that I have been associated with. That one school of thought is that pastor is focused on the right-hand kingdom, theology, sacraments, word, teaching, and there is quite a bright line in the distinction between the right-hand kingdom and the left-hand kingdom, and that is the programmatic side of the church, the day-to-day operational side of the church, that is the exclusive responsibility of the laity leadership. And the pastor, and there's a bright line there that you don't cross.
Yep.
And when we talk about pastor CEO,
Yep.
that to me says we're trying to strike more of a balance here, which is where I would be.
So I would love to answer that, and I want the pastors to disagree with me on this. So I think, from my perspective, I'm just a lowly layperson, right? And I put that title in there, by the way, because I was trying to appeal it to nonprofit organizations and congregations, and so there's a little bit of a mix and match going on here. But I also would say that because every congregation is unique, and that, the congregation I know pretty well in Texas, Concordia San Antonio with Pastor Tucker, there's a sophistication there that allows him to, in some ways, act as a CEO that other congregations and other pastors might not have. And so what I would say is it's not necessarily, I love using this word because I don't really know what it means. It's adiaphora in the sense where you got to do what's best for your congregation as opposed to being a bright line one way or the other. Anybody agree or disagree? Yes. You.
I would just say there's a diversity in Ephesians 4 of evangelist, pastor, teacher, prophet, apostle, and you would, within the right hand, you would want that kind of diversity as well. Now I would tend to see CEO more in the apostolic function. And I think that is a distinction that really matters, particularly in a larger congregation. You need a chief leader that is very apostolic in their orientation.
Yeah. Yes.
So if you're a chaplain, you're pastoring an organization whose primary purpose is not salvation in Jesus Christ, and the purpose of the gospel is supplemental to the military action or caring for individuals in the hospital or something like that. The church is not chaplaincy, and the pastor should not be excluded because the entire intent of the congregation is the proclamation of Jesus Christ. So when you come out of a CEO model, out of a secular world, you dismiss this. You say, I'm the expert, and then that pastor is a chaplain, open with prayer, close with prayer, but stay out of the real big boy decisions. And then the counter is, no, I'm pastor of the church, and our purpose here, the thing we're here to do is what I just prayed about.
Yep.
And so I will not stay out of the big boy decisions, and I will be involved because the gospel must be through all things.
Yep.
It is to be preeminent. That is not optional, that's biblically mandated. But that's not understood if your entire board is really a secular board trying to run a religious institution. And so they pressure you to become a chaplain, and you have to fight
Yeah.
for the right to be a pastor, not to party, okay, right for the right to be a pastor. And so that's a very off-putting circumstance. And we know that the demonic attacks come in the church, not from the outside only, but within. And if you have a secularizing board, because that's what they've cut their teeth on,
Yeah.
I have a Harvard degree, I'm a, so-and-so power,
I-
they don't know where to find Genesis in the Bible.
We're going to talk about that in a second, but that's your elephant in the room. It's one of them anyway. All right, Tom.
So I came in a half hour late, sorry, Kurt. Tim Keller has a great article on church size dynamics. I don't know if any of you have seen that before. That would be super helpful as we think about our different size congregations and how we function.
Yeah.
And why, in the Missouri Synod, we continually have this issue of we can't grow beyond X, Y, or Z. And so much of it is governance, as you know. But
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
a shorter read than your book. Sorry, Kurt.
No, it's good.
Helpful.
Yeah. Tom, we don't care if you read it, just buy it. Tim.
Well, part of this is in our context, in our congregation, we think everything we do is right-hand kingdom. Right? Left-hand kingdom is actually in government, right?
Okay, sure.
Left-hand kingdom.
Sure.
And everything we do, from the cleaning of the toilets to how our children's programs are run, to keeping a neat and tidy church, to mowing the lawn, is serving the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that pastors are called to lead that mission, right? And the lead pastor, especially in a larger congregation, right?
Are you uncomfortable with the CEO role? I know you don't call yourself that.
No, but that's our
Yeah.
our bylaws and board policy reads.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's in essence the board of directors have one
Yeah.
employee,
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then all the other employees report to me, right, of the church. But I'm also held to account for the mission, not, there's this dichotomy of the proclamation of the gospel and theology, also with the moving forward the mission of the church. I never learned I'll be 60 this year, I never learned in seminary that the church's job was to put in football terms, to move the football down the field towards the end zone. I never learned that in a Missouri Synod seminary and a Missouri Synod college. What I learned from seminary, to be honest with you, is to become chaplain in a congregation.
And that's
Right.
not biblical. I just wanted
It
to
is
say, I want to affirm what
it
you're
is
saying.
totally not biblical.
And please, let's have a soda together or something, but that's
I'd rather beer.
yeah.
Kurt said.
So, no church should be able to say, every church is religious. They're not secular. There is no secular activity in a church. This is an oxymoron. And so if you have a board, though, who comes from the secular world, they're going to try to secularize the leadership of your church.
Yeah.
I think, can I just?
Okay, please.
I think the bigger challenge with a traditional Missouri Synod church council structure is in the area of governance,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Is that most church councils are not exercising governance. These are actually your volunteer staff members who are then placed over the pastor
Yeah.
when they're in board meeting, but all of a sudden it's your head of your education board, the head of your trustees, the head of your elders or deacons, whatever you call them, right? And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden, when they come together once a month, they're like operating together, but most of the time they're actually heading up one chunkier mission. And that was always insanity for me.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
do you work for me or do I work for you?
Yes.
Going to a board governance model really clarified that, especially for our staff.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden, do I report to the youth board or do I report to the senior pastor, right? And holy smokes, when we made that switch, I don't know, 15 years ago, holy smokes.
And so they report to you.
It was released. The gospel mission of our church was released.
Interesting.
And powerful, because our church staff felt then empowered.
So what's interesting about that conversation, Tim, is I'm getting a number of phone calls from grade school principals and even Lutheran high school principals, and they're confused about the governance model because they don't know how to relate to the church or how to relate, because it's so tangled up. But it sounds like there's clarity, at least for now, in your church. Which is a great segue. So the last plumbing issue that I will bring up is, what is your elephant in the room? And over time, everyone's going to have an elephant in the room. And the question becomes, and under effective governance, do you have the trust and honesty to effectively wrestle with this and to bring it up? So it could be, for example, in a congregation, changing demographics. Or if you have a day school, it could be the advent of charter school competition or micro schools. It could be lack of technology. It could be lack of members. I mean, there's all sorts of different, in the nonprofit world, outdated technology, new competition, less than secure funding streams, not enough donations. But every organization over time, and it could also be antiquated bylaws and articles or an antiquated governance system, you're going to have an elephant in the room. It's just the way the world evolves. And so the question becomes is, will you intentionally create an opportunity and space to effectively wrestle with that? And that's a question I think everybody has to ask themselves, whether they're in a board position or leadership position or as a pastor. Yeah.
Could you speak to the advisability of consensus decisions versus majority?
You know, yes. Ideally, obviously, you want to have consensus, or at least a vast majority. And my history in terms of being a CEO is, if it was going to be, let's say, 7-6 vote, I would probably pull it off the table and circle back and have some more conversations and understand why there is such disagreement going forward before I would push it through. Now, after 2 or 3 meetings of conversation, and we are now at 13-2, I would go ahead and have the vote, because sometimes there are board members that are just wrong or just maybe don't have the sophistication. And if you feel strongly that this is important for the organization, it doesn't have to be unanimous. But I would probably work the back channels if I thought it was going to be a really close vote, and you never want to lose the vote from a governance perspective. My friend Bill Tucker told me one time, so we had some really difficult decisions to make, and I was really pushing to do something. And his comment to me was, "Kurt, you have a lot of chips, but you just used one." And I knew exactly what he said, right? I mean, and he was right, that we needed, because of a combination of a hurricane and a recession, that we needed to dip into some reserves. But it was because of that trust that we had within the board and the senior leadership team that we were able to come and make that difficult request. Another plumbing issue, I promised to bring up Concordia just to make it fun in this room. Concordia, but think about the plumbing issue within the Concordia University system. There are some Concordias, depending how they're structured, are overseen by the LCMS Board of Directors, Concordia University system, your board of directors. Sometimes it's a foundation board, and accreditation agencies, and the list goes on and on and on. And so the question becomes, is that the proper way to, and is that the most effective way to oversee a large, sophisticated university? You also have the convention, which I forgot to mention. So, 703B coming down the pike. I don't know the answer to this, but what I would suggest, and this can go for nonprofit organizations, for congregations, for the LCMS at every single level, is that sometimes when we don't have trust and we see an issue, we tend to solve it by governance. And I think there might be other ways to solve it. And so, as an example, it could be a memorandum of understanding. It could be at a convention where the resolutions are more gospel, a little bit less law. It could be an auxiliary organization type situation, which LWML and LHM have done a great job of operating under and still being faithful to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. It could be RSO status. There are a number of different ways to get at this. And I'm sensitive, as I've worked with a number of Concordias recently, about the difficulty and the challenges that they have at getting the right people around the table. And I'm not talking conservative or moderate, I'm talking about talent. And so, I know a number of Concordias will use their foundation board to bring in the right talent to at least have those conversations, even though they may not be able to vote on a specific issue. I bring that up because I think our synod has governance challenges. We used to talk about how we have checks and checks. We don't even really have checks and balances because sometimes historically a lack of trust. But my hope and my prayer is that all of us in this room, as well as people out here and others that we come in contact with, can create that sort of environment where we can take a fresh look about what makes most sense to spread the gospel throughout all of our different ministries. Now, I'll leave it at that unless anybody wants to comment. On tape. Tim.
I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because remember back in the day, those were not called boards of regents.
Yes.
They were called boards of
Control. Yes.
In fact, I think our seminary board has actually, in St. Louis, has reclaimed that name, even though it doesn't exist in any documentation.
Oh, interesting.
And so the reality, in a world that says this is about control,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That not about governance, two different things.
Right.
Right? That we need to actually have that conversation. So I'm going to pick on my buddy here, Jonathan. Right? So he needs people on the CPH board who understand the publishing world and the business acumen needed to run a publishing house.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Or have at least the skills and knowledge, not some guy from, the Panhandle of Oklahoma who has an axe to grind because of some book they published.
Right. Right.
Now, he didn't tell me that. That is me talking. That is me talking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? Not Jonathan. I'm not channeling. But the reality is that's what we need, and increasingly so, on boards and so forth that are governance boards.
Agreed. Well, at least the seminary is honest about their title. I didn't say that. Max.
I don't know how you change the structure of Synod, but I do know that we don't talk and collaborate enough. And that really is, I think, where this all needs to start, not in a crisis mode, but that idea of how do we get boards and committees together? How do you get, when's the last time your church council met with the council down the road at the St. Thomas Lutheran Church?
Mm-hmm.
We don't do any of that, or hardly any of that. And what really we got to look at ourselves is we're not fiefdoms, we're divisions, if you will, divisions in a good sense, that we all bring something to the table. But too often, the suspicion is what we bring to the table. Because I don't know what you're doing, but I don't trust you.
Yes.
So to build trust, we need that kind of communication and collaboration. It doesn't work well until you try to force it. And as you know, I've tried to do that some, and I sometimes get called out of my lane. But that's how it's going to have to happen.
And I would add to that we don't always share a common vision which we can all rally around, which is needed going forward. All right, before we get in too much trouble, because I'm sure this will show up in some minutes. So another thing that I think is useful for board members, CEOs, pastors to realize is that there's going to be times when the board, by necessity, will need to lean in, and there'll be board times when everything's running on virtually all cylinders, and so you can take a step back and continue to fulfill your fiduciary responsibilities. And, you know, so for example, I'm sure during the pandemic, during the early days of your pandemic, pastors were pretty much in constant contact with their board of directors. What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? This is what we're doing. I know nonprofit organizations were. There were several times in my life as a CEO where I would actually ask the board chair to create a subcommittee because we were wrestling with some really significant things. Do we want to sell our skilled nursing facilities? Do we want to change our brand? Do we want to, you know, create this program? All of those pieces required our board to play a bigger role than normally they would do. And so it's just an understanding that as you create your own governance model, whatever model you decide, there may be times when you want that board to lean in. There may be times when the board will say, you know, you guys are doing a really great job. We're going to take a little bit of a step back. But it's understanding that there are different seasons of an organization's life. So the question becomes, how do you know whether or not you're... So at the end of the day, how will you know whether or not you have effectively embraced what I call the art of governance? And to me, it's how you answer these 8 questions. It's a scorecard, if you will, and it's a scorecard to determine whether or not your governance model is, in fact, a competitive advantage. So the first question is, do you have a healthy, trusting relationship between the pastor and the board where the pastor is free to share everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, with the board of directors and vice versa? Second, well, the first one is more towards integrity. And do you have that honest environment, that environment of integrity where you do have the trust between the two? And then the second one is talking about, you know, do you share everything with the board, or are you managing the information so that the board doesn't necessarily get everything? Is there a shared focus between your leadership team, however you define it, whether it's a board, leadership team, the pastors, looking strategically into the future, and being on that same page, having that common vision, and also understanding that you know, it's going to need to be appropriately measured and determine whether or not it's effective. 5 is the elephants in the room. Have you identified them? Have you wrestled with them? And does your board actually, do they have the requisite skill sets and is appropriately diverse to actually help you as a pastor, as a president? You know, I can remember when I first started as CEO, I was more worried about just getting through the board meetings and not necessarily use them as confidants, not necessarily using them as my strategic partners. As I got older and as our organization got more complex, I came to really appreciate the value of having good people around that table that are smarter than me in many of the areas that you know, we were dealing with. Is there proactive succession planning, both at the emergency level? You know, if you get hit by a bus today, does your congregation know what you're going to do? It's going to do. And then again, do you have that clearly defined focus strategy that's appropriately monitored, effectively measured? And then does the pastor and the CEO, do you feel supported by your board? And does the board feel supported by the CEO? Is there that relationship where you feel good about? And again, I don't think it's the coach and the quarterback scenario as much as I think it's more like a marriage, where 95% of the time, you know, we support each other as a friend, as a mentor, as a therapist, as a confidant. You know, especially in congregation situations, the pastor is the boss in many ways. Although there are some situations where they're not, right? Depending which model you're using. But it's having that understanding that we're all in this together. So finally, and this I use with the nonprofit organizations, the RSOs that Dorothy and I have been working with in the past. But what I love about Christians, what I love about being a Christian, what I love about serving the RSOs and obviously within the congregations is that we have the ability to bring our faith to the table, and that the Bible is full of such wisdom. It's interesting to me in an earlier book that I wrote is that even though it's so countercultural in the sense that we're here to be servant leaders, we're here to follow the golden rule. When you look at the secular research, it actually is the key to organizational success. And in some ways, as somebody once said, the Bible is probably the best business book that's ever been written. And I think we, as Christians, tend to forget that on occasion. So I have great respect and empathy for everybody here in this room and what you do. I think there are times when we all say, why do we continue to do this? And I think, the answer is, if we want our congregations, if we want our nonprofit organizations, our foundations, our universities, our schools to continue to have an impact in our world and in the communities in which we live, I don't think we have a choice. And so, my prayer is that as a board member, as a senior leader, as a pastor, that you'll continue to embrace this solemn responsibility, because it is a huge responsibility, often unpaid, often at the end of the day when you're tired. But it allows, if you embrace it, it will allow your church, it will allow your organization to, in fact, have this unique advantage within your community that will serve your community, your employees, your donors, and your staff really well. So thank you for what you do, because I think the world depends on you. And I know as we spread the gospel and the Great Commission, we don't have a choice. So thank you. Any last burning comments? We got a few extra minutes, but any last burning comments? Yes, Dorothy.
Could you just talk a little bit about, for a board, how do you vet and how do you onboard those board members? I've heard board members who go, well, they plop this whole policy book in front of me, and some go, we were never told anything, we don't know a thing. So what's the proper way to vet and onboard?
Yeah. And I think it's evolved over the years, but I think a best practice is almost to spend, depending on the sophistication of your organization, but I know in large nonprofits and probably even large congregations, I would spend an entire day in terms of onboarding, really understanding the not only how the governance works, but also getting a preview of the intricacies of the organization, the financial levers, the programmatic levers that get pulled, because otherwise it's going to take a couple of years for them to feel comfortable, right? So I know at Lutheran Hour Ministries, we spend an entire day onboarding new board members, and it's Kurt Buchholz and the chair of the board that do that.
And one of mine, we also create a mentor on the board.
Great.
Somebody that's already
Yep.
there that can
Yep.
fill in the blanks after the meeting and have a follow-up
Ye-
to help catch them up, because
Yes.
you use language that they're not used to, even if you've been onboarded for a whole day. You get
Absolutely.
meetings, you hear all these things that make no sense, and so we create board mentors.
I think that's another great idea. Yes.
So I appreciate your input and the input from any of my esteemed colleagues in the room. I've been asked to sit in between a board and their one employee because the relationship between the two is highly dysfunctional. How do you do that?
What's your role? What would are you just a well-meaning person who's being asked to do this?
This is within the church, and so our church has an interesting structure where, according to our bylaws, to be a voting member of the church or to serve on any board, you have to be loyal to the senior pastor.
In the bylaws?
Yes.
Trump your senior pastor.
Wow.
So that's the framework.
Okay.
And
So I would rewrite the bylaws.
so we're working on that. So it's between one of the boards we have and their primary staff, the one person that reports to that board.
And the board oversees that employee.
Correct. And it's a dysfunctional relationship, and this is not the. That's right. So they've asked me to come in and fix that relationship.
I mean,
Any red flags?
yes. I mean, but you're in a tough situation, right, where you don't feel like you can say no to this. You feel like you have to at least have a conversation. Is that fair?
Don't want to leave it alone.
Yeah, you want to resolve it one way or the other.
Correct.
Yes. From your perspective, do you think this is a board issue or an employee issue, or both?
Is your microphone on?
Not anymore.
In running down the list of things that you said about what's necessary